Tonight, we're stepping into a world where survival wasn't just a skill but an entire way of life, where the howling winds of winter didn't spell doom but simply another season to navigate with knowledge passed down through countless generations. We're exploring one of history's most fascinating survival mysteries, how Native Americans across the frozen landscapes of North America not only survived but thrived through brutal winters while living in what we might consider fragile shelters. Before we journey into the snow-swept plains and ice-bound forests, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy deep explorations into history's most intriguing questions. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Are you wrapped in blankets fighting off your own winter chill, or are you somewhere warm, trying to imagine what it must have been like? Let's dim the lights, settle in, and discover together how Indigenous peoples mastered the art of winter survival in ways that continue to astound modern survival experts. The question that echoes through time. When most people picture Native American dwellings, they imagine teepees standing alone on windswept plains, or perhaps bark-covered structures nestled in forests. The immediate question that follows is almost instinctive. How did anyone survive winter in those? The mental image seems impossible. Thin walls of hide or bark standing between human bodies and temperatures that could plummet to 30, 40, even 50 degrees below zero. The wind alone, screaming across open prairies or cutting through mountain passes, seems like it would rip through these shelters like they were paper. This question reveals something deeper about how we modern people have become disconnected from the wisdom of survival. We assume that comfort requires technology, that warmth demands central heating and insulated walls thick enough to muffle the world outside. We've forgotten that for thousands upon thousands of years, human beings didn't just survive harsh winters. They lived full, rich lives through them, raised children, told stories, created art, and built sophisticated societies. The Native American peoples of North America inhabited one of the most climatically diverse continents on Earth. From the Arctic tundra, where winter darkness stretches for months and temperatures make steel brittle, to the northern Great Plains, where blizzards could bury a camp in hours, to the forests of the northeast, where snow might pile 6 feet deep and stay frozen for half the year, Indigenous peoples developed shelter systems so elegant in their engineering that modern survival experts still study them with admiration. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. There wasn't one answer to winter survival. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of different approaches, each one perfectly adapted to specific environments, available materials, and ways of life. The Tipai of the Plains peoples worked on entirely different principles than the Earth Lodge of the Mandan. The wigwam of the Algonquian tribes bore little resemblance to the igloo of the Inuit. Each solution emerged from deep observation of the natural world, from understanding how heat moves, how wind flows, how materials interact with cold and moisture. What we're about to explore isn't just a collection of survival tricks. It's a window into sophisticated engineering developed over millennia, tested by the harshest conditions imaginable, and refined through countless generations of lived experience. These weren't desperate people barely clinging to survival. They were cultures that understood their environments so intimately that winter, while challenging, was simply part of the cycle of life. The shelters themselves tell only part of the story. Winter survival for Native Americans involved an entire system, clothing designed with principles that modern outdoor companies are only now rediscovering, food preservation techniques that created nutrient-dense provisions lasting months or years, fire management that maximized heat while minimizing fuel consumption, and social structures that ensured knowledge and resources were shared for collective survival. As we journey through the different regions and peoples of North America, we'll see how each group's solutions reflected not just their environment, but their values, their understanding of community, and their relationship with the natural world. We'll discover that the question isn't really how they survived winter in tents. It's how they created living spaces so well designed that they could maintain comfort and security through conditions that would challenge even modern technology. The story begins with understanding that these people saw winter not as an enemy to be fought, but as a reality to be lived with skillfully. They didn't try to create summer in the middle of winter. Instead, they developed systems that worked with the cold, using principles of physics and nature that we're only now fully appreciating. The shelters maintained temperatures that were survivable and even comfortable not through brute force heating, but through brilliant use of insulation, heat retention, and strategic design. What follows is a journey through innovation born of necessity, through wisdom accumulated over thousands of years, through solutions so elegant they seem almost obvious once understood, yet so sophisticated they require deep knowledge to implement successfully. This is the story of how human ingenuity, observation, and adaptation created shelter systems that allowed entire civilizations to flourish in climates that seem almost uninhabitable. The brutal reality of North American winters. To truly appreciate the genius of Native American winter shelters, we need to understand the environments they were designed to withstand. North American winters weren't uniform challenges, but a spectrum of different life-threatening conditions, each demanding its own solutions. On the northern Great Plains, winter arrived like an invading army. Temperatures could drop to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. But temperature alone doesn't tell the full story. The wind, oh, the wind, it screamed across thousands of miles of open grassland with nothing to slow it down, creating wind chill that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Blizzards could reduce visibility to 0 and dump snow measured in feet rather than inches. The dry cold of the plains had a way of sucking moisture from everything, making breathing itself feel like inhaling knives. Then there was the speed with which conditions could change. Stories from early European explorers describe warm autumn days that turned to deadly winter overnight. A hunting party could leave camp in mild weather and return struggling through a blizzard. This unpredictability meant that shelters couldn't be temporary compromises. They had to be engineered to handle the absolute worst conditions, because those conditions would inevitably arrive. In the northeastern forests, winter wore a different face but was no less demanding. Here, snow accumulated in enormous quantities, sometimes reaching depths of 6 or 8 feet. The moisture in the air meant cold that penetrated differently, seeping into bones rather than simply biting skin. Ice storms could coat everything in thick layers of frozen rain, making movement treacherous and fuel-gathering dangerous. The dense forest provided some wind protection, but also created shadows where snow remained frozen from November through April. The cold in these regions had a peculiar quality. It wasn't just the air temperature, but the way cold radiated from the frozen ground, how it seemed to rise up from below as much as descend from above. Rivers and lakes froze solid, their surfaces becoming highways of ice that could support enormous weight, but also became sources of bitter cold wind that swept across their surfaces. The Arctic and subarctic regions presented perhaps the most extreme challenges. Winter darkness stretched for months in the far north, with the sun barely cresting the horizon or disappearing entirely. Temperatures could reach negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The ground itself froze solid to depths of hundreds of feet, creating permafrost that never thawed. Moisture in the air could freeze into ice fog that hung like curtains, limiting visibility and coating everything in frost. But the Arctic cold was different from plains cold. It was constant, unrelenting, and combined with other factors that made survival precarious. Resources were scarce. Trees didn't grow in much of the region, limiting building materials and fuel. Animals were less abundant than in southern regions. The very air seemed hostile to human life in ways that went beyond simple temperature. Even in regions we think of as mild, winter could be deadly. The Pacific Northwest, though generally milder than interior regions, brought its own challenges. Constant rain, fog, and dampness created a different kind of cold, one that crept into everything and made staying dry almost impossible. The dampness meant that traditional heating methods had to account not just for warming air but for managing moisture. The mountain regions presented yet another set of challenges. High altitude meant thinner air and more intense cold. Snow could accumulate to extraordinary depths in mountain valleys. Avalanches were constant threats. The variability of mountain weather meant conditions could shift from survivable to deadly within hours. What united all these different winter environments was their absolute intolerance for error. A poorly constructed shelter in mild weather might mean an uncomfortable night. The same shelter in a plains blizzard or Arctic darkness could mean death. There was no room for approximation or guesswork. The solutions had to work, completely and consistently, or entire families, entire communities could perish. The historical record is filled with accounts of European explorers and settlers who underestimated these winters and paid with their lives. The Donner Party trapped in the Sierra Nevada. The lost colony of Roanoke. Countless individual trappers, traders, and adventurers who thought they understood cold because they had experienced European winters, only to discover that North American winters operated on an entirely different scale. And native peoples didn't have the luxury of underestimating winter. For them, it wasn't an adventure or an inconvenience, but an annual reality that had to be survived with the resources at hand. And they didn't merely survive. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts make clear that winter was a time of social gathering, storytelling, craft-making, and cultural transmission. Life didn't stop when the snow fell. It shifted, adapted, but continued. Understanding this context, the severity and variety of these winter conditions, makes what comes next even more remarkable. The solutions Native Americans developed weren't crude approximations or barely adequate compromises. They were sophisticated engineering achievements that allowed not just survival, but the maintenance of complex cultures through conditions that would challenge even modern technology. The challenge wasn't simply staying warm, it was maintaining livable temperatures while managing smoke from fires, controlling moisture that could rot materials or freeze into ice, preventing carbon monoxide buildup, managing snow accumulation on structures, keeping fuel dry and accessible, and doing all of this with materials gathered from the local environment and tools that would seem primitive by modern standards. The tipi, engineering elegance on the open plains. When most people think of Native American housing, the teepee, or teepee, immediately comes to mind. Its iconic conical shape has become synonymous with Plains Indian culture. But what many don't realize is that the tipi wasn't just a convenient portable shelter. It was a masterpiece of engineering specifically designed to withstand the brutal winters of the Great Plains while remaining light enough to transport as tribes followed buffalo herds. The basic structure of a tipi seems almost deceptively simple. Long poles, traditionally made from lodgepole pine, are arranged in a cone shape and tied together at the top. Over this framework, coverings made from buffalo hide and later canvas are wrapped and secured. An entrance faces east traditionally to catch the morning sun and avoid prevailing westerly winds. At the apex of the cone, 2 adjustable flaps control smoke from the central fire, but this simplicity conceals remarkable sophistication. The conical shape isn't arbitrary, it's the most aerodynamic form for shedding wind. When winter storms screamed across the plains, wind simply flowed around the tipi rather than pushing against flat surfaces that could catch and tear. The steep angle meant snow slid off rather than accumulating dangerously on the roof. The shape also created natural air circulation, with cold air settling at the bottom while warm air rose toward the smoke hole, creating consistent patterns that could be managed and controlled. The hide covering itself was far more than just a wrapper. Buffalo hides, particularly those harvested in winter when fur was thickest, provided substantial insulation. A single buffalo hide could weigh 20 to 30 pounds and was thick enough to block wind completely. Tipis typically used anywhere from 12 to 20 hides depending on size, creating walls that were surprisingly resistant to cold penetration. The hides were carefully sewn together with sinew, creating seams that were both strong and, when properly maintained, remarkably weathertight. But the real genius of winter tipi living came from the adaptations and modifications that plains peoples developed. During summer, a tipi might stand with a single layer of covering, but as winter approached, serious preparations began. The first and most important addition was the dew liner or inner liner. This was a second wall of hide or canvas that hung inside the teepee, suspended from about waist height and extending down to the ground, then angling outward to create a double wall effect. This liner system created an air gap between the outer cover and the inner wall, functioning exactly like modern double-pane windows. The air trapped between the layers acted as insulation, dramatically reducing heat loss. But it did more than that. The liner also controlled moisture. Warm air from inside the tipi, laden with moisture from breathing, cooking, and the fire, would rise and flow up between the liner and outer cover, exiting through the smoke hole. This prevented condensation from forming on the inside walls, which would have dripped back down or frozen into ice. The bottom of the liner didn't just hang straight down, it was designed to angle outward and be secured to the ground with rocks or pegs, creating a channel that directed cold air that seeped under the outer cover upward between the two walls. This turned what could have been a source of drafts into part of the ventilation system. The incoming cold air was warmed slightly before entering the living space, and the system created a natural circulation pattern that drew smoke up and out. But Native Americans didn't stop with the liner. For truly harsh winter conditions, additional insulation techniques were employed. One of the most effective was banking the outside of the tipi with snow, hay, or straw. Snow, counterintuitively, is an excellent insulator when properly packed. Its air pockets trap heat, and a ring of snow banked around the base of a tipi could reduce heat loss through the lower walls by enormous margins. When hay or straw was available, it might be piled several feet high around the perimeter, held in place with additional hides or later with tarps. Some groups built windbreaks around their winter camps. These could be simple structures of poles and brush, or more elaborate constructions of stacked snow blocks. The windbreak didn't need to be tall or completely enclosed, just high enough to deflect wind before it hit the teepee. This could reduce fuel consumption dramatically, as less heat was lost to convection when wind couldn't scour the outer walls. The positioning of teepees also reflected sophisticated understanding of microclimate. Winter camps were typically established in river valleys or other sheltered locations where surrounding landscape features provided natural wind protection. Cottonwood groves were favoured because the trees blocked wind, while their deep roots indicated water access. The east-facing entrance took advantage of morning sun for passive warming, while avoiding afternoon winds that often brought storms. Inside the teepee, the organisation of space reflected both cultural values and practical heat management. The fire pit sat at the centre, directly below the smoke hole. The positioning was precise, too close to any wall, and smoke would curl back into the living space. Too far from centre and the draw wouldn't work properly. Around this fire, sleeping areas were arranged in a circle, with the place of honour opposite the entrance. These sleeping spaces weren't just buffalo robes on the ground, they were carefully constructed platforms. The sleeping platforms, or beds, sat raised several inches off the ground on frameworks of willow sticks or other materials. This elevation was critical. Remember that cold air settles at ground level. By sleeping even slightly elevated, people remained in significantly warmer air. The platforms were covered first with dried grass or sage, which provided both cushioning and additional insulation from ground cold. Over this went multiple layers of buffalo robes, both beneath and over the sleeping person. Buffalo robes deserve special attention, because they were engineered sleeping systems in their own right. A winter buffalo hides, with the hair left on, was incredibly warm. The outer guard hairs shed moisture, while the dense underfur trapped air and insulated. People would wrap themselves in these robes, often sharing them to combine body heat. The robes were large enough to create a personal microenvironment, trapping warm air and creating a warm zone, even when the ambient air in the teepee was quite cold. Fire management in the teepee was an art form. The fire wasn't kept roaring, that would waste precious fuel and create too much smoke. Instead, a small hot fire was maintained, often using dried cottonwood which burned hot, with relatively little smoke. The fire wasn't primarily for heating the air. That's inefficient and would require enormous amounts of fuel. Instead, the fire provided radiant heat, warming people directly, and it heated stones that would then radiate heat for hours after the fire died down. Some groups used a technique called a Dakota fire pit, though this was more common in other shelter types. In a Tipai, fire management focused on maximizing heat from minimal fuel. Dried buffalo chips, essentially dried dung, were excellent fuel, burning hot and long with little smoke when properly dried. Wood was used when available, but on the treeless plains, alternative fuels were essential. The smoke hole management was perhaps the most subtle but critical aspect of tipi engineering. The two flaps at the top, called ears or wings, could be adjusted with poles from inside the tipi. By opening, closing, or angling these flaps, the occupants could control draft. On calm days, the flaps might be open wide to let smoke escape freely. During windy conditions, they'd be positioned to create a venturi effect, where wind passing over the opening created suction that drew smoke up and out. The adjustability meant the teepee could handle varying wind conditions without filling with smoke or losing excessive heat. Historical accounts from traders and explorers who wintered with plains tribes consistently describe teepee interiors as surprisingly warm and comfortable. Pierre-Antoine Tabot, a French trader, wrote in the early 1800s about spending winter with the Arikara and being astonished at how warm their teepees remained, even when outside temperatures were well below zero. He noted that with a small fire and proper clothing, the interior was comfortable enough for extended periods. The teepee also had practical advantages beyond warmth. It could be erected in less than an hour by experienced hands, crucial for nomadic peoples. It could be taken down just as quickly. The poles could be used as a travois for transport. The design was modular. A family could start with a smaller teepee and expand it as they acquired more hides. Repairs were straightforward. Damaged sections could be replaced without dismantling the entire structure. But perhaps most importantly, the teepee was a proven system. It had been refined over centuries, with each generation making small improvements, discovering new techniques, passing along critical knowledge. By the time European contact began, the plains teepee represented hundreds of years of development, a shelter system that worked because it had to work, because failure meant death. The archaeological and historical record shows that plains peoples not only survived winter in teepees, but maintained complex social structures, engaged in trade, created elaborate art, and lived full lives. Winter wasn't something to merely endure, but a season with its own rhythms and activities. Long winter nights were times for storytelling, for teaching children, for craft work that required careful attention. The teepee provided not just survival shelter, but livable space for all the activities that made human life rich and meaningful. Modern recreations and experiments have confirmed what native peoples always knew. A properly constructed and maintained teepee with winter modifications can maintain interior temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than outside temperatures with only a small fire. The insulation system created by the liner, the wind-shedding shape, the carefully managed ventilation, all these factors combine to create a shelter that works with nature rather than fighting against it. Earth lodges, the semi-subterranean marvel. While the teepee gets most of the attention in popular culture, another dwelling type represents perhaps an even more sophisticated approach to winter survival. The earth lodge, used primarily by the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples of the northern Great Plains, was a triumph of engineering that modern architects still study with admiration. These were permanent winter residences that could house multiple families, last for decades, and maintain comfortable temperatures even when blizzards raged outside. The earth lodge at first glance might look like a natural hill or mound. This was entirely intentional. The structure was designed to become part of the landscape, using the earth itself as the primary insulating material. But beneath that unassuming exterior was a carefully engineered building that solved winter survival challenges through principles that seem almost modern in their sophistication. Construction of an earth lodge began with excavation. Unlike structures built on top of the ground, the earth lodge was partially subterranean, with the floor dug down anywhere from 1 to 3 feet below ground level. This positioning was critical. Below the frost line, ground temperature remains relatively constant. While surface air might freeze to -40 degrees, ground temperature a few feet down stay much warmer, often around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. By placing the living space partially below ground, the earth lodge immediately gained a thermal advantage. The excavated area was typically circular or rounded square, ranging from 20 to 60 feet in diameter, depending on how many families would share the space. Larger earth lodges could be 100 feet across and house 30 to 50 people. The size was limited only by the length of available timber for the roof structure and the skill of the builders. Once the pit was dug, the structural framework began. Posts, usually of cottonwood, which was abundant along the Missouri River where these peoples lived, were set into post holes dug deep into the earth. The main support posts, 4 to 6 massive timbers, might be a foot or more in diameter and 20 feet tall. These were arranged in a square or circle at the center of the space, creating the primary support for the roof. Around the perimeter, smaller posts created the outer wall line. The roof structure was an engineering marvel. Horizontal beams were laid from the central post to the outer wall posts, creating a framework radiating out from the center. Over these primary beams, smaller rafters were laid, often in a crisscross pattern that distributed weight evenly. The whole structure had to be strong enough to support enormous weight, because what came next was heavy. Over the wooden framework, layers of materials were carefully applied. First came willow branches, woven between the rafters to create a matrix. This wasn't just random brush tossing. The willows were carefully positioned to create a semi-flexible layer that would support the weight above while allowing some give. Over the willows went grass, thick bundles of dried prairie grass laid in a thatched pattern. This grass layer served multiple purposes. It filled gaps, created additional insulation, and provided a barrier that prevented the next layer from sifting down through the framework. Then came the earth. Not just any dirt thrown haphazardly, but carefully selected sod and soil, placed in layers and tamped down. The sod, cut in blocks like giant bricks, was laid with the grass side down against the thatch layer. This created a root mat that held everything together. Above the sod, dirt was piled and graded, sometimes to depths of a foot or more. The whole mass was sloped and shaped so water would run off rather than pooling. The result was a roof that might weigh dozens of tons, but was supported so well it could hold this weight, plus accumulated snow, plus the weight of people, because earth lodge roofs were used as gathering spaces in good weather. The thickness of all these layers created insulation properties that were extraordinary. Summer heat was blocked from penetrating the interior, and winter cold was similarly resisted. But the earth lodge's brilliance went beyond simple insulation. The walls, like the roof, were multi-layered. After the perimeter posts were set, willow saplings were woven between them, creating a wattle framework. Over this went a layer of clay mixed with grass, the daub, in wattle and daub construction. This clay layer was worked smooth and allowed to dry, creating a hard surface that blocked wind. Behind this inner wall, between it and the earth that was bermed up against the outside of the structure, was an air gap. This gap, like the tipi liner, created dead airspace that insulated. The entrance to an earth lodge was another piece of sophisticated design. Rather than a simple doorway that would allow cold air to pour in, earth lodges featured a long, covered entryway. This tunnel-like passage extended 6 to 12 feet from the main chamber, depending on the size of the lodge. The entrance was typically positioned to face south or east, away from prevailing northern and western winds. The passage itself was angled or had a turn, preventing wind from blowing directly into the living space. This entrance passage served multiple functions. It was a transition zone where people could brush off snow and shed outer garments before entering the warm interior. It blocked wind. It created an airlock effect where warm air from inside couldn't simply flow out while cold air flowed in, and it provided storage space for items that needed to be cool but not frozen. Inside the Earth Lodge, the organization of space was both practical and cultural. The central fire pit, essential for heating and cooking, sat directly beneath a smoke hole in the roof. Unlike the Tippy's smoke hole, the Earth Lodge version was a square opening framed with timbers, and it could be covered during storms with a bull boat, a round boat made from buffalo hide stretched over a willow frame. This portable cover could be quickly put in place when snow or rain threatened, then removed when the fire was lit. Around the fire, the space was divided into family areas, though not with solid walls. Platforms similar to those in Tippy's created sleeping areas, but in Earth Lodges these platforms were more elaborate, often with willow backrests and storage spaces underneath. Each family had their designated area with their own belongings, food stores and sleeping spaces, but the communal nature of the lodge meant people lived in close proximity. This communal living had practical benefits in winter. Body heat from 30 to 50 people contributed significantly to warming the space. Shared fires meant less fuel consumption per person. Knowledge and resources could be shared immediately. Children were never far from adults, allowing constant teaching and supervision. Stories could be told to the entire lodge at once, preserving cultural knowledge. The thermal performance of Earth Lodges was remarkable. Historical accounts from traders and explorers who wintered with Mandan and Hidatsa peoples describe interiors that remained comfortable even when outside temperatures plunged to deadly lows. George Catlin, the artist who documented Plains Indian life in the 1830s, wrote extensively about his experiences in Earth Lodges. He described them as surprisingly warm and comfortable, noting that with even a small fire the interior remained pleasant, while outside conditions were severe. The science behind this comfort is straightforward, but was brilliantly applied. The mass of earth covering the structure had enormous thermal capacity. During the day, any warmth from the sun or from interior fires was absorbed by this mass. The earth heated up slowly, storing energy. At night, when temperatures dropped and fires were banked, that stored heat radiated back into the living space. The thick layers of insulation meant heat loss was gradual. The partially subterranean positioning meant ground temperature provided a baseline warmth. The result was that temperature inside an Earth Lodge didn't swing wildly with outside conditions. While outside temperatures might vary by 40 or 50 degrees between day and night, inside temperatures remained relatively stable. This stability was physiologically important. Human bodies handle constant moderate cold better than extreme swings in temperature. The Earth Lodge provided this stability. Moisture management in Earth Lodges was handled through the same principle as in Tippis, but on a larger scale. The smoke hole created a natural chimney effect. Warm, moist air from cooking, breathing, and the fire rose naturally toward this opening. The entrance passage, being lower than the main floor and not heated, was always cooler. Cold, dry air would sink and flow in through the passage while warm, moist air flowed out through the smoke hole. This natural convection meant that despite housing dozens of people, Earth Lodges didn't become dangerously humid or stuffy. Storage in Earth Lodges was sophisticated. Cache pits, essentially underground storage cellars, were dug into the floor and lined with willow and grass. These pits stayed cool year-round, perfect for storing dried vegetables, corn, and other preserved foods. The constant temperature meant food didn't cycle through freeze-thaw patterns that could cause spoilage. Some Earth Lodges had multiple cache pits, segregating different types of food. Construction of an Earth Lodge was community work and primarily women's work in Mandan culture. The labour required was substantial. Digging the pit, cutting and hauling timber, gathering willow, cutting sod, all these tasks required many hands. But once built, an Earth Lodge would last a decade or more with regular maintenance. Repairs were generally limited to replacing sections of the thatching or patching the sod layer. The structural timbers, if cottonwood was used, might rot after 7 to 10 years and require replacement, but this was a known cycle and planned for. The social implications of Earth Lodge living were significant. These were permanent villages occupied for months or even years at a time. This permanence allowed accumulation of goods, development of larger food stores, and investment in community infrastructure. Villages of Earth Lodges could support populations of hundreds or thousands, creating complex societies with specialized roles, trade networks, and sophisticated cultural practices. When Lewis and Clark wintered near Mandan Earth Lodge villages in 1804 to 1805, they were astonished by what they found. These were not simple camps, but established communities with agriculture, trade, social hierarchies, and architectural achievements that rivaled anything they'd seen. The Earth Lodges provided the stable platform that allowed this complexity to develop. Modern reconstructions of Earth Lodges have confirmed their thermal properties. Temperature monitoring in reconstructed lodges at historical sites shows that even without fires, the interior temperature remains 10 to 20 degrees warmer than outside ambient temperature, simply due to earth insulation and ground warmth. With small fires, comfortable temperatures can be maintained with remarkably little fuel. The Earth Lodge represents a different survival philosophy than the portable tipi. Where the tipi allowed mobility, following game across vast distances, the Earth Lodge anchored communities to specific locations. This anchoring allowed different lifestyles, ones based on agriculture and seasonal hunting, rather than constant following of buffalo herds. Neither approach was superior, they were simply adapted to different circumstances and choices about how to live. What both approaches shared was sophisticated understanding of how to work with winter, rather than against it. The Earth Lodge builders recognized that the Earth itself could be their ally, that mass and insulation could be used to create stable temperatures, that understanding airflow and moisture control was as important as simply piling on layers. They created structures that modern engineers analyze and admire, recognizing principles that we thought we discovered, but that native peoples understood and applied centuries before Western science formalized them. Wigwams and longhouses, woodland engineering. In the northeastern forests, where dense woodlands provided different materials but equally harsh winters, Algonquian-speaking peoples developed shelter systems that represented yet another sophisticated approach to cold weather survival. Wigwams and longhouses, while different in size and specific construction, shared fundamental principles that made them remarkably effective winter dwellings. The wigwam, used by tribes including the Ojibwe, Lenape, and Algonquin, was typically a dome-shaped structure, though some were more elongated or oval. The name itself comes from the Algonquian word for house, and like so many Native American architectural forms, its design was anything but primitive. Construction began with saplings, young flexible trees that could be bent without breaking. These saplings, usually between 10 and 15 feet long and an inch or two in diameter, were cut and sharpened at one end. The basic framework was deceptively simple. The saplings were planted in the ground in a circle or oval, spaced about 2 feet apart. Then, working in pairs, saplings on opposite sides of the circle were bent toward each other and lashed together at the top, creating an arch. This process continued around the circle, creating a dome of intersecting arches. Additional horizontal saplings were then lashed to this framework, circling the structure at different heights. This created a lattice that was both strong and flexible. The flexibility was important. Winter in the northeast brought heavy, wet snow that could accumulate to enormous weights. A rigid structure might snap under this load, but the wigwam's framework could flex and give without failing. The dome shape also naturally shed snow, preventing dangerous accumulation. Wind would flow around the curved surface rather than pushing against flat walls. The covering of a wigwam varied by season and available materials. In summer, cattail mats or sheets of bark might be used, but for winter the strategy became much more elaborate. The goal was to create multiple layers that trapped air and blocked wind. Birch bark was prized where available because it was waterproof, relatively light, and could be sewn into large sheets. These bark sheets would be laid over the framework in an overlapping pattern, like shingles, starting at the bottom and working upward. Each sheet was tied to the framework with basswood fibre cordage or roots. But bark alone, while windproof, wasn't enough insulation for serious cold. Over the bark went another layer, typically woven cattail or rush mats. These mats were substantial pieces of work, woven tightly and sometimes several feet wide and long. They provided an additional air gap and insulation layer. In the coldest weather, additional mats might be added, or hides might be draped over vulnerable spots. Some wigwams had 3 or even 4 layers of covering by midwinter. The interior of a winter wigwam was carefully organized. Like other Native American winter shelters, the floor wasn't simply bare ground. First came a base layer of bark or mats to create a moisture barrier between the cold earth and the living space. Over this went dried grass, pine boughs or cedar boughs, providing both cushioning and additional insulation from ground cold. These materials also had aromatic properties that made the interior pleasant despite being closed up much of the time. Sleeping platforms or areas were created around the perimeter, raised slightly on frameworks of sticks. These platforms were covered with furs and hides, creating warm sleeping spaces. The center of the wigwam held a fire pit, though the fire in a wigwam was typically quite small. Unlike a tipi with its sophisticated smoke hole system, the wigwam's smoke management was more basic. A simple hole at the top allowed smoke to escape, but this meant keeping fires small and using dry wood that produced minimal smoke. The entrance to a wigwam was another critical design element. Rather than a simple door, the entrance typically had a covered passage or vestibule, similar to the earth lodge but on a smaller scale. This might be just a few feet long, but it served the same purpose, creating an airlock that prevented direct drafts into the living space. The entrance was covered with a hide or mat that could be tied shut, creating a seal against the wind. Winter wigwam life required active management of the shelter. Snow that accumulated on the roof needed to be knocked off periodically, though the dome shape meant most slid off naturally. Ice buildup around the base needed to be cleared to prevent moisture from seeping in. The covering materials needed regular checking and adjustment, tightening bindings that loosened, replacing pieces that had torn or worn through. One sophisticated technique used in wigwam insulation was the addition of snow banking in winter. Like tipi dwellers, wigwam inhabitants would pile snow around the base of the structure, creating a natural insulation layer. But this had to be done carefully. Too much snow packed directly against the bark could trap moisture and cause the covering to rot. The solution was to create a slight gap, piling snow in a ring around the wigwam, but not directly against it, or placing brush between the snow and the bark to create airflow. Longhouses represented a scaling up of similar principles. Used by the Iroquois Confederacy and other northeastern peoples, longhouses were just what the name suggests, long. They could stretch 60 to 100 feet in length while being perhaps 20 to 30 feet wide. The construction was similar to wigwams, using bent saplings for the framework, but instead of a dome, longhouses typically had an arched or peaked roof. A longhouse wasn't a single-family dwelling, but housed multiple related families, often sisters and their families, following the matrilineal structure of Iroquois society. Each family had their own section along one side of the longhouse, with shared fire pits down the center aisle. A large longhouse might have 5 or 6 fire pits, each shared by the families on either side. The covering of longhouses was similar to wigwam, but on a larger scale. Sheets of bark, particularly elm bark, which could be harvested in large pieces, were overlaid in shingles. The bark was held in place with poles lashed to the outside of the framework, creating pressure that kept everything tight. Additional mats might be added in winter for extra insulation. The thermal management in a longhouse was different from smaller wigwams. With multiple fires and dozens of people, the structure generated substantial heat from body warmth and cooking fires. The challenge was managing moisture from all this activity. Smoke holes were positioned over each fire pit, but the long structure meant that ventilation patterns were complex. Warm air would rise along the length of the longhouse, flowing toward the smoke holes, while cooler air would sink and flow along the floor. This created natural circulation that, when properly managed, kept the air fresh despite the structure being largely sealed against winter weather. The scale of longhouses meant they could accommodate more sophisticated interior arrangements. Storage areas were built into the walls, using the space beneath sleeping platforms for cached food, tools and supplies. In winter, this storage was extensive, as longhouse communities relied on preserved foods to survive until spring. Corn, beans and squash, the three sisters of Iroquois agriculture, would be stored in braided strings hanging from the rafters or in bark containers beneath platforms. The communal nature of longhouse living had significant survival advantages. If one fire went out in the night, others were still burning, maintaining baseline warmth. If one family's food stores ran low, others could share. The close proximity meant knowledge and skills were constantly exchanged, with children learning from multiple adults, ensuring cultural practices were preserved. Stories told by the fire on winter nights were heard by everyone, reinforcing community values and passing on essential knowledge. Historical accounts from European settlers and missionaries who experienced longhouse hospitality in winter are remarkably consistent in describing them as surprisingly comfortable. Father Joseph François Lafitau, a Jesuit missionary who lived among the Iroquois in the early 1700s, wrote extensively about longhouse life. He described how, despite the cold outside, the interior remained warm enough for people to wear relatively light clothing, though at night they would wrap in furs for sleeping. The sophistication of northeastern woodland shelter systems is sometimes underestimated because the materials seem simple. Saplings and bark don't have the dramatic quality of massive earth lodges or the iconic status of typis. But the engineering knowledge required to create these structures was no less sophisticated. Understanding which trees to use for frameworks, when to harvest bark for best quality, how to create waterproof seams, how to maintain adequate ventilation while minimizing heat loss, all these required deep knowledge accumulated over generations. Modern attempts to recreate traditional wigwams and longhouses have revealed just how skilled their builders were. Getting the framework curved properly requires experience and knowledge of wood properties. Creating tight, waterproof bark covering requires technique and patience. Managing the interior climate to prevent moisture buildup while maintaining warmth is a constant balancing act. What looks simple from the outside represents mastery of multiple complex skills. Wigwams and longhouses also demonstrate how Native American winter survival was never just about the shelter itself. The structures were part of larger systems. The forest provided materials but also windbreaks and moderated temperature extremes. Food storage techniques ensured nutrition through the long months. Clothing systems, including sleeping furs, extended personal insulation beyond what the shelter alone provided. Social structures meant knowledge and resources were shared. The wigwam and longhouse represent a forest people's approach to winter, using abundant timber and bark rather than scarce hides or earth. They show how the same fundamental principles, insulation through layering, wind protection, moisture management, careful fire control, could be implemented with different materials to create equally effective solutions. The dome of a wigwam and the long arch of a longhouse worked as well for their inhabitants as the cone of a tipi worked for plains peoples, or the earth-covered mound worked for the Mandan. Arctic and sub-Arctic adaptations. Engineering at the edge. In the far north, where winter is not a season but a state of being that lasts most of the year, where temperatures can drop to levels that seem incompatible with human life, indigenous peoples developed perhaps the most extreme adaptations to cold. The Inuit and other Arctic peoples created shelter systems for conditions so harsh that simply being outside for extended periods could mean death. The igloo, probably the most famous Arctic dwelling, represents engineering genius so elegant it seems almost magical. How can a structure made entirely of frozen water provide warmth? The answer reveals principles of thermodynamics applied with perfect understanding, despite having no formal scientific training in the Western sense. Igloo construction began with the right kind of snow. Not all snow works for igloo building. What's needed is snow that has been compressed by wind, creating a relatively dense, cohesive mass that holds together when cut but isn't so hard it can't be shaped. This wind-packed snow is cut into blocks, typically about 3 feet long, 2 feet high, and 6 inches deep. The tool used is traditionally a snow knife, though modern Inuit might use a saw. The first blocks are laid in a circle, but here's where the genius begins to show. The top of these first blocks is cut at an upward angle, creating a spiral rather than stacked layers. This spiral means each subsequent block leans inward slightly and is supported by the block before it. As the spiral rises and curves inward, the blocks create a dome shape. The dome is mathematically the strongest shape for distributing load, crucial when the structure might have to support the weight of accumulated snow or even a polar bear walking over it. As blocks are added, they're shaped with a snow knife to fit perfectly against their neighbours. The joints between blocks don't need to be perfectly sealed initially, because a surprising thing happens. The warmth from inside the igloo, even just from body heat, causes a thin layer of snow at each joint to melt slightly, then refreeze into ice. This creates natural mortar that seals gaps and strengthens the structure. Within hours, an igloo's blocks have essentially fused together. But an igloo made only of snow blocks would still be quite cold. The real thermal magic comes from what happens to the snow itself. Snow is full of air pockets trapped between ice crystals. Air is an excellent insulator when trapped and prevented from circulating. The snow blocks of an igloo are essentially frozen foam, containing vastly more air than ice. This trapped air creates an insulation layer that dramatically slows heat loss. The dome shape is critical for heat retention. Warm air rises, so in an igloo, the warmest air accumulates at the top of the dome. This creates temperature stratification, with the top of the igloo potentially being 30 or 40 degrees warmer than outside, while the floor might be only slightly above outside temperature. Sleeping platforms are built inside the igloo, raised a foot or two above the floor, positioning sleepers in the warmer air layer. The entrance to an igloo is never a simple doorway at ground level. Instead, a tunnel is dug below the floor level of the main chamber. This tunnel might be 10 or 15 feet long. The configuration creates a cold air trap. Cold air, being denser, sinks into the tunnel and stays there. Warm air from inside cannot flow out because it rises. This creates a natural thermal seal that's remarkably effective. Even with the entrance completely open, warm air doesn't escape as long as the entrance tunnel dips below the floor level. Inside the igloo, additional modifications enhance warmth. Snow platforms are carved from the floor, creating raised sleeping areas. These platforms put sleepers in the warmest air layer. Skins and furs are laid on the platforms, creating insulation between people and the cold snow. A small oil lamp, traditionally burning seal oil, provides both light and heat. The lamp doesn't need to produce much heat because the igloo is so well insulated that even a small heat source makes a difference. The moisture management in an igloo is elegant. As warm, moist air from breathing and the oil lamp rises, it contacts the cold inner surface of the dome. This causes some condensation, but the snow absorbs this moisture. Over time, the inner surface becomes slightly glazed with ice from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. This glaze is actually beneficial, creating a smoother, more windproof surface while the snow beneath continues to insulate. Igloos could be built incredibly quickly by experienced hands. Historical accounts describe skilled Inuit building a serviceable igloo in an hour or less, creating emergency shelter during storms or hunting trips. More permanent winter igloos might take several hours and include additional refinements like a second smaller dome as an entrance chamber, shelves carved into the walls for storage, and even windows made from clear ice inserted into gaps in the walls. But not all Arctic peoples relied on igloos. In areas where snow conditions weren't suitable or where longer-term dwellings were needed, semi-subterranean sod houses were constructed. These structures used principles similar to earth lodges but adapted to Arctic materials and conditions. The basic structure began, like the earth lodge, with excavation. A pit was dug down several feet, getting the living space closer to the constant temperature of deep earth. A framework of driftwood, whalebone, or whatever timber was available was erected. In the treeless Arctic, wood was precious, often gathered as driftwood or traded from southern areas. Whalebone, massive and curved, made excellent structural members when wood wasn't available. Over this framework, layers of sod were placed. Arctic sod, cut from tundra where plants grow slowly and densely, was particularly cohesive, holding together in blocks like bricks. The sod was laid with living plants facing outward, creating a self-healing outer layer. Over the sod, additional earth might be piled, creating insulation that could be several feet thick. These sod houses, sometimes called kamaks, could be quite large, housing extended families through the long Arctic winter. The entrance was similar to an igloo's, a long tunnel that trapped cold air. Inside, platforms created sleeping and living areas. Small oil lamps provided heat and light. The thick layers of earth and sod insulated against brutal cold, while the partial underground construction took advantage of Earth's thermal properties. Life in Arctic shelters during winter was a study in managing limited resources. Fuel for lamps was precious, coming from seal blubber or whale oil. Every aspect of daily life was organized to maximize efficiency and minimize waste. Clothing, even more than the shelter, became the primary defense against cold. Going outside required elaborate preparations, donning multiple layers of carefully tailored fur garments that created personal microenvironments. The historical record shows that Arctic peoples didn't just survive, but maintained rich cultures through conditions that defeated European explorers. When British naval expeditions attempted to find the Northwest Passage in the 1800s, entire crews perished from cold and scurvy while Inuit families lived nearby in relative comfort. The difference wasn't toughness, but knowledge, knowing how to build proper shelter, how to dress for extreme cold, what to eat to prevent deficiency diseases, how to find and prepare food in winter. Modern scientific analysis of traditional Arctic shelters reveals principles that engineers now apply to cold weather construction. The importance of thermal mass, the value of earth insulation, the effectiveness of entrance cold traps, the use of trapped air as insulation, all these were understood and applied by Arctic peoples long before thermodynamics was formalized as a science. The Arctic represents the extreme end of the spectrum, the coldest, darkest, most resource-poor environments where humans have lived permanently. That indigenous peoples not only survived there, but developed sophisticated cultures, complete with art, music, complex social structures, and deep spiritual traditions, is testament to the power of accumulated knowledge and intelligent adaptation to environment. Clothing as personal shelter, the outer layer. While shelter structures provided the base for winter survival, clothing represented the most immediate and personal layer of protection against killing cold. Native American clothing systems for winter were as sophisticated as their shelters, representing deep understanding of insulation, layering, and material properties. In many ways, proper clothing was even more critical than shelter, because while you might spend part of the day outside hunting, gathering, or traveling, you lived in your clothes all the time. The buffalo hide robe represents one of the most effective pieces of clothing ever developed for extreme cold. These weren't simple blankets thrown over shoulders, but carefully constructed garments that created complete thermal protection. A winter buffalo robe was made from hides taken between November and March, when the animal's fur was at its thickest and longest. At this time, buffalo developed a two-layer coat, with long outer guard hairs that shed moisture and rain, and a dense inner layer of soft, curly underfur that trapped air. The preparation of a buffalo robe began immediately after the animal was killed. The hide was carefully skinned to avoid any cuts that would create weak points. Hides destined for robes were not dehaired like those used for tipi covers or other purposes. Instead, they were treated through a process called brain tanning that left the hair intact while making the leather side soft and pliable. Brain tanning is a remarkable preservation technique that Native Americans perfected. The process is based on a biological fact that every animal has enough brains to tan its own hide. The buffalo's brains would be removed, mixed with water, and worked into a paste. This paste was applied to the flesh side of the hide, working it in thoroughly. The brains contain emulsifying agents that break down the proteins in the hide, making it soft and pliable while preserving it from decay. After the brain treatment, the hide was worked over a rope or beam, pulling and flexing it to break up fibers and make it supple. This working was labor-intensive, often taking hours for a large buffalo hide. Finally, the hide was smoked over a fire, usually one burning sage or other aromatic woods. The smoke completed the preservation process and gave the hide a pleasant smell, while also making it water-resistant. The finished buffalo robe was substantial, weighing 20 or more pounds. The warmth it provided was exceptional. The combination of the leather backing and the fur insulation could keep a person warm in temperatures well below zero. The robes were large enough to wrap completely around a person, creating a personal cocoon of warmth. They could be used as sleeping blankets, worn as cloaks during the day, or placed over shoulders while sitting by a fire. But winter clothing wasn't just about buffalo robes. Complete winter outfits required multiple pieces, each serving specific functions. For the upper body, shirts made from deer, elk, or antelope hides provided a base layer. These were often decorated with quillwork or beadwork, but the decoration served practical purposes too. The quills and beads added slight texture that created tiny air gaps that enhanced insulation. Over the shirt might go a vest or additional layer, sometimes made from fur, with the hair side facing either in or out depending on the design. The layering principle that modern outdoor enthusiasts have rediscovered was well understood by native peoples. Multiple thin layers that trap air between them insulate better than a single thick layer. Leggings protected the legs and were critical for people who spent time wading through snow or sitting on frozen ground. These were essentially tubes of leather or fur that covered from ankle to hip, tied to a belt at the top, and secured at the ankle. Winter leggings might be fur-lined or made from winter hides with the hair left on and facing inward, creating a fur-lined pocket for each leg. Moccasins, the iconic Native American footwear, were far more sophisticated than they might appear. Winter moccasins were constructed with several features that enhanced warmth. The basic moccasin was made from a single piece of soft, tanned leather, shaped and sewn to create a shoe that fit closely but not tightly. For winter, these might be stuffed with dried grass or fur for insulation. The grass served both as cushioning and as an insulation layer that could be refreshed as it became compressed or damp. Some groups created mukluks, higher boots that came well up the calf or even to the knee, providing protection for more of the leg. These were particularly common in Arctic regions where walking through deep snow was constant. The mukluks were lined with fur and could be stuffed with additional insulation materials. Mittens were preferred over gloves in extreme cold because keeping the fingers together allowed them to share warmth. Winter mittens were made from fur, often with the hair facing both inward and outward, creating maximum insulation. They were large and loose, allowing air circulation and making them easier to remove when needed. Long cuffs could be tucked into or pulled over sleeves, preventing snow from getting in. Headgear was critical because the human head loses heat disproportionately to its surface area. Fur hats, sometimes with ear flaps or full face coverage, protected against frostbite and conserved body heat. In extreme conditions, Arctic peoples developed hoods that integrated with parkas, creating a tunnel that protected the face while allowing breathing and vision. The design of winter clothing reflected deep understanding of how the body loses heat. Clothing was generally loose rather than tight, creating air gaps that enhanced insulation. Seams were sewn carefully, often with overlapping folds that prevented wind penetration. Furs were oriented thoughtfully, with hair direction chosen to shed moisture or trap air as needed. Material selection was based on careful observation of animal properties. Caribou fur, used extensively in the Arctic, has hollow hair shafts that trap air, making it one of the warmest natural insulators relative to its weight. Beaver fur is dense and naturally oily, providing water resistance. Rabbit fur is incredibly soft and warm, but less durable, used for inner layers or clothing that wouldn't see hard use. Each animal's hide had properties that suited it for specific uses. The sophistication of Native American cold weather clothing has been demonstrated repeatedly by Arctic explorers who adopted Inuit designs. When Roald Amundsen became the first person to reach the South Pole in 1911, he credited his success partly to using Inuit-style fur clothing rather than the wool and cotton favoured by his rival, Robert Scott, whose expedition ended in tragedy. Modern cold weather gear, for all its high-tech materials, often replicates principles that Native Americans understood centuries ago. Clothing also had to be maintainable in field conditions. Sewing kits with sinew thread and bone needles were essential. A torn seam in extreme cold could be life-threatening, so repairs were made immediately. Fur that became wet from snow or condensation was dried carefully by fires, turning it frequently to prevent scorching. Grease might be applied to leather to maintain its suppleness and water resistance. The social and cultural significance of clothing was inseparable from its practical function. Elaborately decorated garments demonstrated skill and status, but also served as teaching tools, with designs encoding stories and knowledge. The creation of clothing was often women's work, and the quality of a woman's sewing and hide preparation was a matter of pride and practical importance. Children's winter clothing required special consideration because children lose heat faster than adults and are more prone to frostbite. Their clothing was made with extra insulation, and they were bundled extensively when outside. Babies were carried inside mothers' parkas in the Arctic, using the mother's body heat to keep them warm while keeping them protected from wind and cold. The principle of clothing as personal shelter meant that people could survive outside for extended periods even in brutal conditions. A hunter might be away from camp for days, sleeping wrapped in his robe directly on the ground or snow, and remain comfortable enough to function. This mobility and independence were critical for survival, allowing people to range widely for food and resources even in winter. Food storage and winter nutrition. No matter how well engineered the shelter or how sophisticated the clothing, winter survival ultimately depended on having enough food. The growing season in much of North America was short. Game could be scarce in winter, and stored food had to last months. Native American food preservation techniques were the result of centuries of experimentation and represented deep understanding of how to prevent spoilage without refrigeration. Pemmican stands out as perhaps the most remarkable preserved food ever developed. This concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries provided complete nutrition in a form that could last years without spoiling. The name comes from the Cree word pimi, meaning fat or grease, reflecting the importance of this ingredient. The creation of pemmican began with lean meat, typically from buffalo, elk, deer, or moose. The meat was sliced into thin strips, similar to jerky but cut even thinner. These strips were dried in the sun or over low fires until they were completely desiccated, so dry they would crack and shatter rather than bend. This drying was critical because any remaining moisture would cause spoilage. In humid climates, meat might be dried over smoky fires, which added flavour while the heat and smoke accelerated drying. Once the meat was completely dry, it was pulverized. Traditionally, this was done by pounding it between stones until it became almost a powder. Modern researchers recreating pemmican use food processors, but the goal is the same: breaking the meat down into small particles that will mix well with the fat. Some makers preferred a coarser grind, creating a texture more like ground meat, while others pulverized it almost to dust. The fat component of pemmican was just as important as the meat. Not just any fat would work, it had to be rendered suet, the hard fat from around the kidneys and loins of animals. This fat has a high melting point and stays solid at room temperature, unlike softer fats that would make the pemmican greasy and prone to rancidity. The suet was cut into small pieces and heated slowly until it liquefied. The liquid fat was strained to remove any bits of tissue, leaving pure tallow. The ratio of meat to fat in pemmican was roughly 1:1 by weight, though this varied. Too much meat and the mixture would be dry and crumbly. Too much fat and it would be greasy. The powdered meat was mixed with the melted tallow while the tallow was still liquid, ensuring even distribution. If berries were being added, typically dried choke cherries, blueberries, or cranberries that had been similarly pulverized, they were mixed in at this stage. The mixture was formed into balls or patties or packed into rawhide bags called parfleches. As it cooled, the tallow solidified, binding everything together into a dense, stable food product. Properly made pemmican could last years without refrigeration. The complete drying of the meat removed moisture that bacteria need. The fat created an anaerobic environment that prevented spoilage. The concentration meant that a pound of pemmican contained the nutritional equivalent of several pounds of fresh meat. The nutritional profile of pemmican was nearly perfect for winter survival. It was energy-dense, with fat providing more than twice the calories per gram compared to protein or carbohydrates. The protein provided essential amino acids. When berries were included, they added vitamins, particularly vitamin C, preventing scurvy, the scourge of many European explorers who lacked this knowledge. The fat was satisfying and provided slow-release energy, keeping people fueled through long cold days. Pemmican could be eaten as is, a portable meal requiring no preparation. But it was also versatile. It could be boiled with water and vegetables to create a stew. It could be fried with wild onions or other additions. Some groups mixed pemmican with bone marrow, creating an even richer mixture. The portability and stability made it ideal for winter travel or hunting trips where carrying fresh meat would be impractical. But pemmican was just one of many preservation techniques. Drying alone, without the addition of fat, was used for many foods. Fish were split and dried on racks, creating stockfish that could be rehydrated in stews or soups. Corn was dried either on the cob or after removing the kernels, then stored in bark containers or woven bags. Beans and squash were similarly dried. Smoking was another preservation method, particularly for meat and fish. Unlike drying, which simply removed moisture, smoking added chemical compounds from the wood smoke that inhibited bacterial growth. Cold smoking, done at temperatures below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, was particularly effective for long-term preservation. The food would be suspended in a smokehouse or covered structure where a smouldering fire, often of hardwood or fruit wood, produced dense smoke. This process could take days or weeks for thick pieces of meat or fish. Cache pits served as underground food storage. These were carefully engineered structures dug into the ground, often lined with bark or grass, and filled with dried foods. The pits were shaped like bottles with a narrow neck and wide bottom, making them harder for animals to raid. Once filled, the opening was sealed with bark, then covered with soil and marked with stones so it could be found later, even under snow. The cache pit's positioning was critical. It had to be above the water table to prevent flooding, but deep enough to stay cool. In permafrost regions, the permanently frozen ground provided natural refrigeration. In areas without permafrost, the Earth's constant temperature, around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, several feet down, kept food cool enough to prevent rapid spoilage while not freezing it solid. Different foods required different cache strategies. Some foods, like dried corn or beans, could be stored in relatively dry conditions. Others, like root vegetables, needed some moisture to prevent desiccation. Layering different foods with grass or bark between layers prevented flavors from mixing and allowed air circulation. In regions with heavy snow and cold winters, natural freezing was utilized. Meat could be frozen solid and remained edible for months. The key was preventing freeze-thaw cycles that would damage food structure and create opportunities for spoilage. Foods were often bundled in hides or bark and buried in snow or permafrost, creating natural freezers that maintained constant sub-zero temperatures. Rendered fat itself was an important stored food. Beyond its use in pemmican, tallow was preserved in sealed containers, traditionally in bladders or large intestines that were tied off. This fat could be used for cooking, adding calories to otherwise lean foods, treating leather to keep it supple, or even as emergency lighting fuel. Bone grease was another concentrated food source. After meat was removed from bones, the bones themselves were cracked and boiled in water. The marrow and any remaining fat would melt and rise to the surface where it could be skimmed off. This bone grease was pure fat, rich in calories, and could be stored for later use. Wild rice, actually not rice but an aquatic grass seed, was a critical stored food for many northern peoples. It was harvested in late summer or fall, parched or roasted to dry it, then threshed to remove the hulls. The resulting grain could be stored for years and provided carbohydrates that balanced the protein-heavy winter diet. Maple sugar represented another important stored food, particularly for northeastern woodland peoples. In late winter or early spring, when sap began running in sugar maple trees, it was collected and boiled down to syrup or crystallized into sugar. This sugar could be stored indefinitely and provided concentrated calories and sweetness that made other foods more palatable. The timing of food gathering and preservation was critical and required precise knowledge of seasons and weather patterns. Foods had to be harvested at peak ripeness or condition. Meat from animals taken at certain times of year was superior for preservation. Fish runs occurred in specific seasons. Plants had to be gathered when their nutritional content was highest. This required detailed knowledge of the natural cycles, knowledge that was carefully preserved and passed down through generations. The winter diet wasn't just about calories, but about maintaining health through months without fresh foods. Indigenous peoples understood, through observation if not formal nutrition science, that certain foods were necessary. The inclusion of berries in pemmican prevented scurvy. The consumption of organ meats provided vitamins that muscle meat alone lacked. The preparation methods, such as fermentation of some fish, created foods rich in vitamins and beneficial bacteria. Storage locations had to be remembered through winter, when landmarks might be buried under snow. Mental maps and memory systems, sometimes encoded in stories or songs, ensured that cache pits could be located when needed. The loss of a major food cache could be disastrous, so redundancy was built into the system with multiple smaller caches rather than one large storage. The social dimensions of food storage were significant. Large-scale preservation activities, like pemmican making after a successful buffalo hunt or salmon smoking after a fish run, involved entire communities. The work was shared, the knowledge was shared, and often the resulting food was shared, creating networks of reciprocity that ensured everyone had food through winter. The sophistication of Native American food preservation becomes clear when compared to European methods of the same era. While Europeans relied heavily on salt for preservation, which was often imported and expensive, Native Americans used methods that required only knowledge and labor. The diversity of preservation techniques meant that multiple types of foods could be stored, creating varied winter diets rather than monotonous salt pork and hardtack. Fire management and heat retention. Fire was central to winter survival, providing warmth, light, and a means to cook food. But fire management in Native American winter shelters was far more sophisticated than simply keeping a blaze going. It involved understanding combustion, heat transfer, fuel efficiency, and smoke control, all optimized for the specific shelter type being used. The central fire pit in most shelter types wasn't randomly positioned. Its placement was calculated to maximize heat distribution while managing smoke. In Tipis, the fire sat directly below the smoke hole, ensuring smoke had a straight path upward. The distance from the ground to the smoke hole created natural draft, pulling smoke up and out. On windy days, the adjustable smoke flaps could be positioned to enhance this draft, using the venturi effect, where wind passing over an opening creates suction. The size of the fire was carefully controlled. A large, roaring fire wastes fuel and creates excessive smoke. For most shelter types, a small, hot fire was more efficient. This required using the right wood. Hardwoods like oak or hickory, where available, burned hotter and longer than softwoods. Cottonwood, common along plains rivers, burned hot and relatively clean when properly dried. Different woods were chosen for different purposes, some for heat, others for light, still others for cooking. Fuel preparation was a constant winter activity. Wood had to be gathered, cut to appropriate lengths, and kept dry. In teepees, a supply of wood was maintained inside, around the perimeter, where it wouldn't interfere with activities but would be dry and ready to use. The drying of wet or frozen wood was itself a challenge. Often wood brought in from outside was stacked near the fire to dry before being used as fuel. In regions where wood was scarce, alternative fuels were critical. Buffalo chips, the dried dung of buffalo, were excellent fuel on the treeless plains. When properly dried, they burned hot and clean, producing steady heat with minimal smoke. The gathering of buffalo chips was often children's work, as it was relatively safe and didn't require the strength needed for wood gathering. Heat retention strategies enhanced the efficiency of fires. Rocks placed around or in the fire pit would absorb heat during the day and radiate it back into the shelter at night when the fire was banked. These weren't just random rocks, they were carefully selected stones that wouldn't crack or explode when heated. River rocks, which might contain trapped moisture, were avoided in favor of dry, dense stones. The practice of banking a fire for the night was an art. The goal was to keep coals alive without producing smoke or consuming excessive fuel. Wood would be arranged over the coals in specific patterns that restricted airflow, slowing combustion. Ashes might be partially banked over the fire, insulating the coals while limiting air. A properly banked fire could be revived in the morning by blowing on the coals and adding kindling, rather than having to start a new fire from scratch. Fire starting in winter presented challenges. Friction methods like bow drills worked but required dry materials. Punk wood, partially rotted wood that catches easily from sparks, had to be kept dry. Tinder bundles of dry grass, bark shreds, or other fine materials were prepared and stored where they'd stay dry. Once Europeans introduced steel and flint, fire starting became easier. But the principle remained: you needed dry tinder and the knowledge to nurse a spark into flame. Heat reflection was another principle used to maximize fire efficiency. In some shelter types, flat stones or pieces of bark were positioned behind fires to reflect heat into the living space. This essentially doubled the useful heat from a fire, with the radiant heat warming the space directly, while reflected heat warmed areas that weren't in direct line of sight of the fire. The management of smoke was as important as the management of heat. Smoke inhalation was a constant hazard in closed shelters. The natural convection that drew smoke up and out could be defeated by wind conditions, cold outside air that prevented proper draft, or improperly positioned fires. Understanding how to troubleshoot smoke problems was essential knowledge. One technique was controlling the moisture content of wood. Wet wood produces more smoke than dry wood. In winter, when outside wood might be frozen or snow-covered, keeping a supply of dry wood inside was critical. The difference between a smoky, miserable shelter and a comfortable one often came down to fuel quality. The cultural and social aspects of fire management were significant. Fire was often tended by specific people, with knowledge of proper firekeeping passed down through generations. Stories told by the fire on winter nights weren't just entertainment, but vehicles for transmitting knowledge, including proper fire management. A tale about someone who built their fire too large and ran out of fuel might be a cautionary lesson for children learning these skills. The ceremonial and spiritual significance of fire in many Native American cultures reinforced careful management. Fire was often seen as a gift, something to be respected and cared for properly. The first fire of a new shelter might be lit with ceremony. The maintenance of fire through winter was sometimes seen as a sacred duty. In communal structures like longhouses or large earth lodges, fire management required coordination. Multiple fires meant multiple people needed to understand proper techniques. But it also provided redundancy. If one fire went out or was poorly managed, others could provide heat and light. The tools for fire management were simple but effective. Sticks for adjusting burning wood, pokers for moving coals, implements for transferring fire from place to place, all were carefully made and maintained. The loss of fire-making tools could be serious, so they were protected and valued. Modern camping and survival instructors teaching wilderness fire skills often rediscover principles that Native Americans understood completely. The importance of fire placement for smoke management, the value of reflectors, the efficiency of small fires over large ones, the critical nature of dry fuel, all these lessons have been relearned by people trying to recreate primitive conditions. Community and cultural knowledge systems. Winter survival wasn't solely about physical preparations and structures. The social organization and knowledge transmission systems of Native American peoples were equally critical to getting through the cold months. The way communities were structured, how knowledge was preserved and passed on, and how resources were shared all contributed to collective survival. The communal nature of many winter dwellings, particularly earth lodges and longhouses, meant that winter was a time of close social contact. This proximity wasn't just about shared warmth, though that was important. It ensured that knowledge was constantly being transmitted. Elders who held critical survival knowledge were always present, always available to answer questions, always observing and correcting younger people who were learning skills. Winter storytelling served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. Stories encoded practical information in memorable forms. A tale about a hunter who ignored signs of changing weather might teach weather observation skills. A story about proper food preparation might contain actual instructions embedded in narrative. Myths explaining why certain animals behave in specific ways could teach animal behavior patterns relevant to hunting. The repetition of stories throughout long winter nights served a mnemonic function. Children hearing the same stories every winter, year after year, would absorb the information they contained without conscious study. The emotional content of stories, the drama and excitement, helped fix them in memory. This was education, but education through culture rather than formal instruction. Skills teaching during winter took advantage of the close quarters and relative leisure. Hide working, tool making, basket weaving, all these crafts were winter activities when there was time for careful work, and experienced practitioners were available to teach. A grandmother teaching a girl to sew winter moccasins wasn't just passing on a craft, but ensuring survival skills would continue into the next generation. The social structures that ensured sharing were critical. In lean times, food sharing meant the difference between some people starving while others had plenty, or everyone having enough to survive. The obligations of kinship, the reciprocity built into gift-giving customs, the spiritual beliefs about generosity, all these cultural factors encouraged sharing that was pragmatically necessary. Leadership systems in winter camps had to balance individual family autonomy with collective needs. Decisions about when to move camp, how to respond to emergencies, how to distribute resources, all required coordination. The political structures, whether council-based democracy, clan systems, or other forms, provided mechanisms for making collective decisions that affected survival. Gender roles and the division of labor ensured that all necessary work was accomplished. While these roles varied among different peoples, the general pattern in many cultures was that men hunted and women processed food and made clothing. Neither role was superior, both were essential. The interdependence meant that survival required cooperation, and that knowledge specific to each role had to be preserved. The training of young people began early and was comprehensive. Children weren't sheltered from reality, but were gradually integrated into adult work. A young boy might begin by helping to gather firewood, progress to helping with hunting preparation, and eventually become a hunter himself. A young girl might help with basic food preparation, advance to hide tanning, and eventually master the complex skills of creating clothing and shelter materials. The social safety nets built into many Native American communities meant that orphans, widows, elders, and others who couldn't fully provide for themselves were cared for. A child whose parents died wasn't abandoned, but was taken in by relatives. An elder too old to hunt was still fed and valued for knowledge and wisdom. These practices weren't just charity, but recognition that any member of the community might need help, and that collective survival required protecting all members. The seasonal cycle of activities meant that preparation for winter began long before the first snow. Summer and fall were times of intensive work, gathering and preserving food, preparing shelters, making and repairing clothing and tools. The foresight to prepare adequately required understanding the full yearly cycle and planning accordingly. Knowledge of weather prediction was crucial and was preserved through careful observation passed down through generations. The behavior of animals, the patterns of plant growth, the appearance of clouds, the strength and direction of winds, all these were observed and interpreted to predict how harsh the coming winter might be and when it would arrive. The spiritual and ceremonial life of many Native American peoples included winter-specific practices. Ceremonies might be performed to ensure successful hunting, to honor the spirits of animals that provided food to celebrate midwinter, or to prepare for spring. These ceremonies reinforced community bonds and provided psychological sustenance through the difficult season. The oral history traditions meant that unusual events, particularly severe winters or successful survival strategies, were remembered and transmitted. A winter of extraordinary hardship might be remembered in stories for generations, along with the creative solutions people used to survive. This institutional memory helped communities prepare for rare but possible extreme events. The value placed on knowledge meant that those who held specialized skills were respected and their knowledge was actively sought. A person who understood weather patterns, or who was particularly skilled at shelter construction, or who knew the best methods for preserving food, held valuable social capital. This created incentives for people to develop and maintain expertise. The integration of practical knowledge with spiritual understanding meant that winter survival had meaning beyond mere physical persistence. Many Native American peoples saw themselves in relationship with the natural world, not separate from it. Winter was part of the sacred cycle of seasons, each with its own lessons and gifts. This worldview could provide resilience in the face of hardship, seeing difficulty as part of a larger pattern with purpose and meaning. The careful observation of the natural world that characterized many Native American cultures meant that changes were noticed and understood. The migration patterns of animals, the growth cycles of plants, the freeze and thaw patterns of water, all were observed with attention that exceeded what was strictly necessary for survival, representing a deep engagement with and curiosity about the environment. The passing of knowledge wasn't just about winter survival specifically, but about a holistic understanding of living in the environment. A person learning to survive winter was also learning about the land, the animals, the plants, the weather, the seasons. This comprehensive ecological knowledge informed decision-making and problem-solving in all seasons. The creation of winter gathering spaces, whether in longhouses, earth lodges, or winter camps, facilitated the exchange of knowledge across families and even between different bands or tribes. Trade of information was as important as trade of goods. A successful hunting technique developed by one group might spread through social networks, improving everyone's chances of survival. The living legacy. As we bring our journey through Native American winter survival to a close, the picture that emerges is one of remarkable sophistication and adaptation. These weren't primitive peoples barely scraping by in harsh conditions. They were cultures that had solved the complex problem of winter survival so thoroughly that they didn't just survive but thrived, maintaining rich cultural lives through conditions that would challenge even modern technology. The shelters we've explored, from the wind-shedding cone of the Tipa'ai to the earth-insulated mass of the Mound Lodge, from the flexible dome of the wigwam to the brilliant engineering of the igloo, each represents generations of refinement. These weren't lucky accidents, but carefully developed solutions based on deep understanding of materials, heat transfer, structural engineering, and human needs. The clothing systems, particularly the buffalo robe and the layered approach to insulation, demonstrate principles that modern outdoor companies are still learning. The food preservation techniques, especially pemmican, created nutrient-dense provisions that sustained people through months without fresh food. The fire management practices extracted maximum heat from minimum fuel while controlling the ever-present danger of smoke. But perhaps most importantly, we see that winter survival was never just about technology or technique. It was about knowledge systems that ensured critical information was preserved and transmitted. It was about social structures that promoted sharing and mutual support. It was about cultural values that emphasized preparation, observation, and respect for the natural world. The modern world has much to learn from these approaches. As we face our own challenges, from climate change to resource scarcity to the need for more sustainable living systems, the wisdom of peoples who lived successfully with their environments for thousands of years offers valuable insights. The principles they applied, working with nature rather than against it, using renewable resources sustainably, creating resilient systems that didn't depend on outside inputs, all remain relevant. The legacy of Native American winter survival skills lives on in multiple ways. Many Native peoples maintain connections to traditional knowledge, keeping these skills alive through practice and teaching. The outdoor recreation industry continually rediscovers principles that Indigenous peoples knew all along. Survival instructors teach techniques that have roots in Native American practices. Sustainable building movements look to Earth Lodge and other traditional architecture for inspiration. But the legacy is also a cautionary tale about how easily knowledge can be lost. European contact and subsequent colonization disrupted many traditional practices, forced relocation to different environments, prohibition of traditional practices, boarding schools that separated children from their families and cultures. All these contributed to loss of knowledge. Much has been preserved, but much has also been lost. The importance of valuing and preserving Indigenous knowledge cannot be overstated. For modern people interested in self-sufficiency, outdoor skills, or sustainable living, studying Native American winter survival techniques offers practical knowledge, but also something deeper. It offers a different way of thinking about relationship with environment, about community, about the integration of practical knowledge with cultural meaning. It challenges us to think about how we've become dependent on systems that can fail and to consider alternative approaches that are more resilient. The question we started with, how did Native Americans sleep in tents without freezing to death, has an answer that's both simple and complex. The simple answer is that they understood their environments completely, developed sophisticated technologies adapted to local conditions, and maintained knowledge systems that ensured these technologies were properly implemented. The complex answer is that they created entire cultural systems built around successful adaptation to challenging environments, systems where winter survival wasn't a desperate struggle but a normal part of life that was managed through preparation, knowledge, and community. As we modern people face our own winters, whether literal or metaphorical, there's something profound in recognizing that human beings can adapt to extraordinary challenges when they approach them with observation, innovation, and accumulated wisdom. The Native American peoples who survived and thrived through winters that killed unprepared Europeans weren't tougher or more resistant to cold. They were smarter about working with their environment. The shelters they built, the clothing they wore, the food they prepared, the fires they tended, all these physical elements of winter survival were supported by non-physical elements, knowledge carefully preserved, social structures that promoted cooperation, cultural values that emphasized preparation and respect for nature, spiritual understandings that gave meaning to hardship. This holistic approach, where practical survival was inseparable from cultural life, created resilient systems that worked. As we conclude this exploration, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity and wisdom of peoples who solved one of nature's most challenging survival problems. Their solutions weren't just adequate, they were elegant, sustainable, and deeply integrated with ways of life that valued community, respected the natural world, and passed knowledge across generations. In our modern age, when winter for most of us means adjusting a thermostat, it's worth remembering that not so long ago, people kept themselves warm through their own skill and knowledge, and they did it successfully for thousands of years. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's survival wisdom, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These long-form explorations of historical mysteries and survival knowledge take time and research to create, and your support makes them possible. Drop a comment and let me know what other historical survival topics you'd like to see explored. What other questions about how our ancestors lived intrigue you? Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and remember that the past holds wisdom we're still discovering. Good night.